Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an extended look at Part 2 of Aspyr's Tomb Raider Remastered collection, and see how it stacks up to the original late 90s, early 2000s games in terms of their graphic quality, art direction, and included features. Because this remastered collection has its own built-in graphics toggle hotkey that can be activated at any time, I'll be referring to the classic mode graphics included in the collection itself, as the developers once again preserved the original games in their entirety, blocky Minecraft-looking Lara and all. However, it's important to note that while this classic mode is nearly identical to what you may have played back in the day, it's still been tweaked a little bit too, with things like higher resolution support out of the box, support for modern operating systems, and most importantly, critical fixes that previously required tedious third-party modding and file configuration. Like before, we're not going to focus on any of those little changes that were made to the classic graphics scheme over the original DOSBox or PS1 and PS2 versions. We're instead going to focus mainly on the changes that were made with the new remastered graphics mode, including how it benefits each game's presentation, and in some cases, how it may even hurt them. Once again, neither of the three games in this collection offer any sort of graphics settings to tweak. The game will automatically detect your monitor's resolution and default to a native output. So in this case, the footage you're seeing is from the game running at 4K. It's also worth noting that this time around, all three games support an option to bump up the frame rate even when playing in the older graphics mode, allowing players who prefer the older graphics style to enjoy much smoother performance. Also, before we jump into it, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, where you can find a ton of other Tomb Raider related content, including an extensive breakdown of the previous remastered collection, and a full history of the series itself, both of which I'll provide links for in the description. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first talking about the changes that were made to the iconic pistol-wielding archaeologist herself, Lara Croft. Like with last year's remastered collection, Lara has been given a major overhaul, with a design more reminiscent of her appearance in the old core-era promotional material, cinematics, and artwork, as opposed to her much less impressive, low-poly design used to represent her in-game. With these later three entries to the classic saga, Croft's polygonal in-game model did improve slightly over her original debut, with more detailed facial textures, animated lips for talking during in-game cinematics, and even small details like drawn-on creases and shading to help accentuate her figure more. Though, aside from those texture updates, and some very minor improvements to her poly count, she generally is animated the same as those original three games and maintains that same general silhouette. The sixth entry included in this newest collection is a different story, as it was the first game in the series to make the leap to the PlayStation 2 generation, and therefore benefits technically with a substantial uptick to her poly count, texture quality, and animation design. But we'll talk about this more in a bit. As far as The Last Revelation and Chronicles are concerned, the developers for this remaster appear to have stuck with the same updated model that they used in last year's collection, with the same facial model, textures, and various extra details they incorporated before. The outfits are slightly updated, accounting for the changes that were made in those games in the past, like the tighter tank top that rides up on the sides. The catsuit from Tomb Raider III also makes its return, and looks significantly better than the catsuit used in the original Chronicles game, with superior shader work that gives it a much more realistic leather appearance, and details like zippers and creases at the joints. I also like the addition of boots here that previously looked like they were part of the suit itself, along with a redesign to the sunglasses and headset that feels more grounded and less sci-fi. Her winter camo garb looks a lot better too, with a new black knit turtleneck collar that looks much better than the full camo turtleneck look that made the outfit look like some weird military pajamas before. Then there's the young Lara model. This is supposed to be Lara at 16 years old, and I have to say, neither of these designs really work. On the one hand, I'm glad they gave her less revealing clothing this time around, but at the same time, it does look like they just reused the same face model of the standard adult model in the remaster. It's technically altered a tiny bit, but the pigtails and the Barbie-styled makeup they have her wearing just gives her this really bizarre look. Either way, the clothing textures are technically improved, the poly count is increased, and the hair cards and ponytails are all a much higher quality, something that applies to every version of Croft across her several adventures in these two games. Now, Angel of Darkness, on the other hand, doesn't share quite the same level of improvement here. Lara absolutely looks better in the remastered visual style, but the differences here are almost exclusively texture related, along with some smoothed out edges thanks to an increase to the character's poly count. From a distance, the two look nearly identical, though the improved shaders on the skin textures help produce that plasticky look of Lara previously, and the much higher res texture maps for her clothing, especially the jean jacket and pants, are a considerable improvement over the very muddy, stretched out looking textures on the same clothing before. Her hair also has more realistic volume now, especially with her ponytail, that previously just used a somewhat convincing texture to fake the braid, but now has enough complexity to show each looped braid individually as part of the model's silhouette. Her black tank underneath also seems to be more cotton-based this time, rather than the weird latex-looking shader that gave it this shiny look before. And like the other remastered versions of the character, all those smaller details like her backpack, weapons, belts, and holsters are all nicely enhanced too. Again, all these remastered models, textures, and details aren't necessarily the best they could have been, but as far as improving over the original designs of these 25-year-old games, it's a welcome improvement nonetheless. Like with Lara herself, the items found in the game world have also been greatly improved. Just like before, all of her weapons, health kits, flares, and key items have been given a complete overhaul, maintaining the original look and style of those objects, while still improving textures as you'd expect. The items in AOD have also seen some nice updates, with improved poly counts, rounding out things like these bandages. And of course, we can't forget about the various other NPCs, mainly enemies that players will face throughout their journeys, that have all received pretty significant updates that generally improve on those original core designs. Creatures like the Nile crocodiles, deadly scorpions, and the hordes of scarab beetles all feature huge upticks to their poly count that help to hide their retained and somewhat clunky movement animations. Textures are all updated too, sometimes with redone shaders as well. And in some cases, new detail have been added too, like teeth, whiskers, and claws for this lion. Some of the best changes come with the more human enemies, like the masked guards that will occasionally attack Lara as she explores the tombs in Egypt, that look significantly better now that their weapons aren't just two blocks stuck together, and their heads aren't shaped like small birdhouses. More supernatural enemies, like the skeleton soldiers, have considerably more bones rendered this time, and look much more anatomically correct in general. Though I will submit that the texture resolution for the bone, especially in the skull, could have been improved further, as they really don't hold up that great despite the added poly count. I'm also a bit disappointed in some of the changes made to various human enemies as well. This is a complaint I had with last year's remaster too, as characters like Lars still look absolutely ridiculous in the remaster, with an overly beautiful looking face that doesn't seem to match up with the character's previous dumb guy look. We see this trend continue with several other characters, like this guide in one of the early levels of The Last Revelation, that had this weird yet distinctive facial structure before, that doesn't seem to be reflected at all with this newer, much more generic facial model. And then there's the lead antagonist, Von Croy himself, that, like Lars, has been given an almost Disney princess look that doesn't really match up with the look of the low-res texture map from before. The design they went with isn't necessarily terrible, as it's a little bit more consistent with what a young Von Croy might have looked like, especially when considering how he appears in cinematics, but it doesn't quite nail the look either. Skipping ahead to Angel of Darkness, the characters here are a mixed bag. In some cases, the characters have received a pretty significant overhaul, with new hair carves, reworked facial geometry, updated textures, and added details. But then there's other character models that I guess were deemed less important, that have literally not been touched at all, giving it a very inconsistent presentation. As for the cinematics, all of the previous rendered FMVs are included and play in full screen, with very minimal changes made, if at all. There seems to be some denoising going on here, but when you toggle back and forth between the two versions, the difference really just boils down to the contrast being slightly higher with the remastered, which ends up hiding a lot of that background detail in the process. The in-game cinematics are redone too, with new animations for characters that previously relied on only changes to the facial textures to talk. But because these latter games were much further along technically than their predecessors, the changes here aren't nearly as drastic, and are pretty much non-existent by the time you get to Angel of Darkness. Next up, let's talk environments. Like last time, the updates to the environments are where we see a lion's share of the improvements with the remasters, with beautifully retouched locations that maintain that original vision, but also toss in just enough to make the area appear more convincingly, without removing too much of its extremely important readability within Tomb Raider's strict grid-based platforming format. Again, this applies more so to Revelations and Chronicles, as those games maintain that same design mentality of the original trilogy. Because of the various incremental improvements that Core had made during those last few years of the 1990s, the environments they built in Egypt, Cambodia, Rome, Ireland, Russia, and a New York skyscraper are all significantly more detailed than the locations that we discussed last year. And because of that, the developers behind this remaster had significantly more objects, texture maps, and complex geometry to clean up. And all in all, I'm happy with practically every change that was made. These locations are gorgeously reimagined, with some great upscaled texture work that stays faithful to those original blurry surfaces from before, and rarely, if at all, feel out of place. I especially love that the developers went above and beyond for some of these textures of statues and stone reliefs that are now fully rendered as actual objects in the world. Textures of windows and doors that were completely flat before in the streets of Rome or Alexandria now jut out of the wall, adding a considerable amount of depth to otherwise very dull, empty spaces. New decorative assets were added in as well, like fallen leaves along this path in Cambodia, underneath the added tree canopies, or Italian flags hanging over this market in Rome. All the various object models like statues, pots, jars, and other supplemental pieces of the environment have been given increased polycounts and high-res textures as well. In some cases, they may even feature new baked shadow effects too, which I'll get into in a bit. Though nothing has been added that may impact the flow of the gameplay either, ensuring the game is just as playable as its older classic graphics scheme. The game's geometry has been updated too, usually in out-of-reach areas like these new breaks in the ceiling, extra curves for organic objects like tree roots, and subtle cracks at corners of platforms, maintaining the illusion of a real environment while also ensuring that the game's grid design remains just as readable as before. Then there's the game's skyboxes that were in desperate need of a redesign, as these older skyboxes usually were cut off at the horizon, leaving an empty black void. Now, the skyboxes use a much higher resolution image, and are often supplemented with some great background objects like additional buildings and vegetation. I especially love the updates to the Roman Colosseum, that previously relied on a very obvious skybox past these windows here, but now utilizes a fully rendered Colosseum backdrop. Chronicles probably presents the most interesting challenge for the remaster team, as there are several simply bizarre level designs in this late core design game that I couldn't imagine being redone in a way that made sense. And despite their best efforts, the layout of some of these more ridiculous stages, especially the Ireland ones, remain a complete mess. These aren't really the best Tomb Raider games after all. But for players that really like the spooky Ireland chapters or the weird Mission Impossible style finale, the developers made sure to do each and every one of these stages justice. Angel of Darkness has seen a ton of changes in this department too, though they are much more limited to just texture updates than anything else. Nearly every surface in the game world has been upscaled with higher res texture maps, that for the most part maintain that original look and feel. Though it does seem as though they relied a bit too heavily on what appears to be AI upscaling solutions, as I did find some truly bizarre changes to very well-known textures, especially this one that makes the Mona Lisa look like, well, you tell me. There's a few objects with some upped poly counts too, which is most noticeable when looking at rounded objects like barrels, trash cans, jars, and bottles. Though, in general, these environments are already significantly more detailed than those older PS1 era titles. And while they certainly could have benefited from some additional flourishes, it looks decent enough even with just these few changes. In fact, there's so many changes across all three titles that I decided to provide a brief showcase of some of my favorite updated locations across the collection. Let me know what you think. Which level environments do you feel received the best improvements overall? Another major change you probably already picked up on when looking at these games, at least with The Last Revelation and Chronicles that is, are those changes that were made to the lighting design. Like with Tomb Raiders 1 through 3, The Last Revelation and Chronicles have seen a complete revamp to their global lighting, resulting in a much darker presentation overall. Objects that were previously unrealistically lit are now more properly cast in shadow from nearby geometry. Ambient lighting in general is impacted considerably, and will likely require players to make more liberal use of flares just to find their way around. It's not as drastic a change as something like path tracing would introduce, as there's plenty of pre-calculated lighting going on to ensure a consistent visual tone. But there's a very clear distinction between these two versions that can often make the game world less readable as a result. Occasionally, there would be a switch that was impossible to find with this new lighting design, and I wasn't able to locate it until I switched back to the classic graphics mode and flew around with the photo mode enabled. An even worse issue occurs here in this Egyptian adventure sequence of The Last Revelation, in what's already a ridiculously convoluted puzzle, made more difficult by the removal of important texture clues and baked shadows from before. Thankfully, while these issues are definitely problematic, they're not that common. More often than not, the lighting changes greatly enhance the look and feel of these areas, adding much needed atmosphere to locations that previously could appear very bland. The courtyard in Alexandria, for example, previously looked like it was in pure daylight, save for the skybox. Now, it looks like it's actually taking place in the sunset as it was supposed to. There's also a ton of new little skylights and accompanying light rays that look great in these opening Cambodia caves or the catacombs beneath Rome, along with the various crypts in Ireland. The developers even threw in some nice planar reflections for the marble floors of the Von Croy building in the final chapters of Chronicles. That really helps to enhance this scene, even if there's no reflections for dynamic models like Lara or other enemies. When it comes to Angel of Darkness, the changes to lighting are basically non-existent. I looked at dozens of different light sources throughout a good chunk of the game, and none of them seemed to be different regardless of which setting I chose to play with. There were a few extremely minor adjustments to things like light rays in some areas, like this Tomb of the Ancients. But really, all you can expect from this side of the remaster collection are those changes to the environmental textures and characters. Like with the lighting, the shadows are all pre-calculated in the remaster. There are a few new shadows thrown in, especially around newer lighting elements like torches, that have this nice wavy effect and help to enhance the atmosphere that much more. But don't expect them to cast any real-time shadows for any of the character models. That being said, there are new shadows for the characters, replacing the old disc shadows from before. But these too seem to be based on the global light positioning, and don't seem to react to any of the smaller light probes added throughout. With so much more ambient lighting in these remasters, it would have been nice to see some more accurate shadow casting. But at the same time, I can see where it would have been problematic in maintaining the readability of these environments, especially considering the developers have since added in a feature to spot items on the ground with a highlight that was never necessary with the older graphics style. AOD shadows have seen some very slight improvements too, which is most noticeable when looking at these trees in the Paris streets. Though this may have more to do with the changes that were made to the objects themselves, as opposed to changes to how the game renders its shadows. Then of course, we have to talk about the effects. The effects remain a sore spot for me with these remasters, as the game's water rendering still just doesn't hold up with the rest of the improvements made. The surface of the water just looks lifeless in these collections, and lacks that strong caustic simulation that core design had used, making underwater sequences feel a bit simpler and not as interesting visually. It doesn't necessarily look bad, but there are areas where that bright greenish-blue tinge seems to be missing entirely, which really hurts the presentation greatly in more scenic locations, especially around these brown and yellow Egyptian tombs in The Last Revelation. Fire effects are thankfully improved, using higher quality alpha layers for flames, rather than the bright orange-looking gas particles that the series adopted with Tomb Raider III. It looks great at certain angles, though the overlapping, flat alpha layers isn't the most eloquent solution either. It also doesn't seem to apply to things like torches, or characters when they're lit on fire, falling back to the older method in these cases instead. As for other miscellaneous effects, The Last Revelation and Chronicles do throw in a few extra flourishes, like new sand particles that flow over dunes, or higher res electrical arcs and explosions. I also like the little fog and incense smoke added to these darker tombs that really helps to enhance the ambiance of these locations further. Angel of Darkness, once again, doesn't make nearly as many improvements in these areas either, with a few very minor improvements to the resolution of alphas like water bubbles and fire layers. Though, in staying consistent with the visual style of the other titles, it at least looks similar enough to fit in with the rest of the collection. Finally, let's wrap up with an extended sound comparison. Here I picked out a few classic sequences from each game to illustrate how the audio quality differs between the original and remastered versions. Which version of each Tomb Raider do you prefer?
wire looks like it will take my weight. Press start to tuck my legs up. Looks like it will take my weight. Press start to tuck my legs up.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Tomb Raider Remastered 4 through 6 is another solid addition to the series, bringing back 3 long-forgotten titles that are regularly neglected. The Last Revelation in particular is a gem within the classic Tomb Raider saga, with some of the most challenging puzzles and level designs in the series' history. There's still a lot of questionable design decisions, especially when it comes to gameplay mechanics that are never properly introduced to the player, and can cause them to get stuck with very few clues on how to proceed. And then of course there's Angel of Darkness's complete shift to an entire genre altogether, attempting to mix in stealth action into a game that just isn't built for it. But regardless of how you feel about these 3 titles, the remasters do a fantastic job of restoring them to the state that makes them actually playable to new and old fans alike. The character models are mostly improved upon, save for some NPCs in Angel of Darkness, and some weird Disney-fied looking antagonist here and there. And the environments have seen some much needed overhauls too, maintaining the original platforming scheme while further contributing to the intended thematic style. And best of all, both the remastered graphics and the original graphics can now be played at a high frame rate, at a high resolution, without having to sift through configuration files and other tedious fan-made modifications, giving players immediate access to Lara's last few adventures at the turn of the century. But what do you guys think? Are you interested in picking up this latest Tomb Raider Remaster collection? Let me know in the comments section. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.